Sometimes the hardest truths are buried where we least expect them. For Hank Calloway, those truths lay in a moss-covered coffin in the Montana pines. The aging cowboy had spent 30 years running from his past, living alone with his German shepherd. Pride kept him from looking back at bitter words exchanged with his family. Then, on a routine ride, his dog led him to something that would change everything. The old coffin shouldn't have been there, resting among the pines like a forgotten secret. When Hank opened it, he found his brother Billy, missing for decades, and a journal filled with unsent letters. What do you do when you discover the person you've been running from had been searching for you? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light filtered through the pines like honey through cheesecloth, casting long shadows across Hank Calloway's weathered cabin. At 68, his joints protested the mountain cold more than they used to, but routine was routine. He pulled on his boots with practiced efficiency, the leather worn soft from decades of use, and stepped onto the creaking porch. Duke lifted, his massive head from his spot by the door, amber eyes alert and questioning. The German shepherd's coat had gone grey around the muzzle, mirroring his master's beard, but those eyes still held the intelligence and loyalty that had made him Hank's constant companion for the past 8 years. "Morning, old boy," Hank murmured, running his fingers along the worn leather collar that had been Duke's since puppyhood. The collar was a deep brown now, darkened by weather and time, with Duke's name stamped in fading letters. It was one of the few things Hank had bothered to replace over the years, not because it was broken, but because Duke deserved something that would last. The cabin sat in a clearing carved from the Montana wilderness, surrounded by towering pines that whispered secrets to the wind. Hank had built it himself 30 years ago, when solitude felt like salvation rather than sentence. The structure was solid, practical, nothing fancy, but it kept the weather out and the loneliness in. Inside, the main room served as kitchen, dining room, and living space. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its mantel bare except for an old photograph turned face down. Hank had stopped looking at it years ago, but couldn't bring himself to throw it away. The kitchen consisted of a wood-burning stove, a sink with a hand pump, and shelves lined with canned goods and simple provisions. He'd never needed much. The bedroom held a single bed, a chest of drawers, and a closet containing 3 changes of clothes, all variations of work shirts, jeans, and flannel. On the nightstand sat a lamp, a glass of water, and nothing else. No books, no magazines, no connection to the world beyond these mountains. Duke padded inside and settled by the fireplace while Hank prepared their morning routine. Coffee first, black, strong enough to wake the dead. Then oatmeal with a touch of honey he'd traded for last summer with the beekeeper down the mountain. Duke got kibble mixed with leftover bacon fat, a breakfast that would have horrified a veterinarian, but had kept the dog healthy and happy for years. They ate in companionable silence, as they had every morning for the better part of a decade. Duke never begged, never whined, never asked for more than Hank was willing to give. It was a quality Hank appreciated more than he could express. The dog simply accepted what was offered and found contentment in it. After breakfast, Hank stepped outside to check the weather. October in Montana meant unpredictable skies. Sunshine could turn to snow without warning. Today looked promising, though. Clear skies, light breeze, temperature holding steady around 40 degrees, perfect for their daily ride. The stable sat 50 yards from the cabin, weathered wood that had turned silver gray over the years. Inside, Jasper waited in his stall, a 20-year-old quarter horse with more patience than any creature had a right to possess. The horse had been young when Hank first arrived in these mountains, full of spirit and fire. Now they were both, old together, 2 creatures who understood the value of routine and the comfort of familiar companionship. Hank saddled Jasper with movements made automatic by repetition. The leather was supple and well-maintained, the only indulgence Hank allowed himself. Good tack was essential in country like this, where a broken strap could mean the difference between making it home and spending a cold night in the wilderness. Duke waited by the stable door, tail wagging slightly. He knew the routine as well as anyone. Once Hank mounted up, Duke would range ahead and alongside, always within sight, always alert for anything unusual. In 8 years, they'd developed a language of looks and gestures that required no words. The trail they followed wound through dense pine forest, past meadows where deer grazed in the early morning light, and alongside streams that ran clear and cold down from the peaks. Hank knew every tree, every rock, every turn in the path. This was his world, small, predictable, and safe. He'd chosen this isolation deliberately, though the reasons had grown hazy with time. There had been anger once, hot and righteous, that drove him from everything familiar into these mountains. There had been hurt so deep it felt like physical pain, the kind that made a man want to disappear entirely. But anger fades, and hurt scabs over, leaving only the habit of solitude. The nearest town was Timber Creek, 40 miles down a winding mountain road. Hank made the trip twice a year, once in spring for supplies, once in fall for the same purpose. The townspeople knew him as the hermit from up the mountain, polite but distant. He paid his bills in cash, spoke only when necessary, and left as quickly as he'd come. Mrs. Henderson at the general store always asked how he was doing, her eyes kind behind wire-rimmed glasses. He appreciated her concern, but never encouraged. Conversation. What was there to say? That he lived alone with a dog and a horse, that he read old westerns by lamplight, that he'd forgotten what his own voice sounded like until Duke came along. Sometimes, in the deep quiet of winter nights, Hank wondered if he'd made the right choice all those years ago. The anger that had driven him here was gone, replaced by something harder to define. Not regret exactly, but a kind of wondering. About roads not taken. He'd had a family once, back when he was young and sure of everything. A brother who looked up to him, parents who expected great things, a future that seemed bright with possibility. But that was before the words that couldn't be taken back, before pride became more important than blood, before walking away seemed like the only choice that made sense. He'd been 28 then, strong and certain and completely wrong about what mattered. Now he was 68, still strong, but no longer certain about anything except the reliability of sunrise and the loyalty of the dog who shadowed his steps. Duke had appeared on a winter morning 8 years ago, half frozen and starving. Probably abandoned by someone who couldn't care for him properly. Hank had intended to feed him and send him on his way, but the dog had other ideas. He'd simply stayed, making himself useful, asking for nothing but companionship. It had taken Hank 3 months to name him, another 6 to admit he'd grown attached. Duke seemed to understand that his human needed space, needed silence, needed the kind of loyalty that didn't ask questions or demand explanations. In return, Hank provided food, shelter, and the kind of quiet affection that developed between two creatures who'd both learned that attachment could hurt. Now, as they followed their familiar trail through the morning forest, Hank found himself grateful for the dog's presence in ways he couldn't articulate. Duke made the silence bearable, the isolation less complete. The dog's enthusiasm for each day's small adventures reminded Hank that there was still beauty in the world, still reason to get up each morning and face whatever came. The trail curved ahead, disappearing into a stand of particularly dense pines. They'd followed this route hundreds of times, but Duke suddenly stopped, ears pricked forward, nose working the air. Something was different. Hank reined in Jasper, studying the dog's body language. In 8 years, Duke had never led him astray. If something had caught the dog's attention, it was worth investigating. "What is it, boy?" Hank asked, his voice rusty from disuse. Duke looked back at him, then toward the trees, then back again. The message was clear. This way. Hank dismounted, ground-tying Jasper with the confidence that came from years of partnership. The horse would wait, cropping grass and dozing in the sunshine. He'd learned patience from his master. Duke padded into the trees, following some scent or instinct that Hank couldn't share, but he trusted the dog's judgment more than his own. These days, in the wilderness, instinct often mattered more than logic. The undergrowth was thicker here, the canopy dense enough to block most of the morning light. Hank pushed through carefully, mindful of his footing on the uneven ground. Duke moved ahead with purpose, pausing occasionally to ensure his human was following. They'd gone perhaps 100 yards when Duke stopped completely, hackles raised, a low whine escaping his throat. Hank had never heard the dog make that sound before. Not fear exactly, but something close to it. Something that said the world had shifted in ways that demanded attention. Hank pushed through the last of the undergrowth and stopped dead. There, in a small clearing he'd never seen before, despite 30 years of wandering these mountains, sat an object that had no business being there. An old coffin, weathered and moss-covered, resting on the forest floor, as if it had grown there like the trees themselves. Duke whined again, pressing close to Hank's leg, seeking comfort or offering it. The worn leather collar was warm against Hank's palm as he absently stroked the dog's head, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. In 30 years of solitude, Hank Calloway had convinced himself he was beyond surprise. He was wrong. The coffin was simple pine, darkened by decades of weather and carpeted with moss that spoke of long years undisturbed. It sat level on the forest floor, as if someone had taken great care in its placement, though no grave markers or disturbed earth suggested burial had ever been intended. Hank circled it slowly, Duke keeping pace beside him, both of them treating the object with the wariness reserved for things that shouldn't exist. The wood was old, but solid, held together with iron fittings that had rusted to a deep brown. No ornamentation, no brass, nameplate, just the kind of simple box a working man might choose for his final rest. But why here? This clearing was miles from any cemetery, accessible only to those who knew the mountain trails well enough to navigate without established paths. Hank had been walking these woods for 30 years and had never stumbled across this particular spot. Yet the coffin looked as if it had been here far longer than that. Duke whined again, pressing closer to Hank's leg. The dog's distress was palpable, and it fed Hank's own growing unease. Animals sensed things humans missed, and Duke was clearly picking up on something that set his instincts jangling. "Easy, boy," Hank murmured, more for his own comfort than the dog's. He knelt beside the coffin, running his weathered hands along its surface. The wood was smooth under his palms, worn by wind and rain, but remarkably intact. Whoever had built this knew their craft. The joints were tight, the construction solid enough to withstand whatever the Montana wilderness could throw at it. The lid was held down by simple iron latches, green with verdigris but still functional. Hank's fingers hovered over them, hesitation warring with curiosity. Whatever was inside had been placed there deliberately, hidden away in this forgotten corner of the forest. Did he have the right to disturb it? But the alternative was walking away, leaving questions unanswered, and 30 years of solitude had taught Hank that unanswered questions had a way of festering. Better to know than to wonder. The first latch gave way with surprising ease, as if it had been opened recently. The second required more effort, but finally yielded to his persistence. Hank took a deep breath, steeling himself for whatever revelation awaited, and lifted the lid. The hinges protested with a groan that seemed unnaturally loud in the forest silence. Duke backed away several steps, tail low, clearly wanting no part of whatever lay inside. Hank stared down into the coffin and felt the world shift beneath him. The skeleton was old, held together more by the remnants of clothing than by sinew and bone. But it was the clothing that stopped Hank's breath. A red flannel shirt, faded but unmistakably familiar. Blue jeans worn soft with age. Work boots that had seen better days but were still intact. And on the skeletal hand, a silver ring that Hank recognized with a shock of memory so sharp it was almost physical pain. Billy, his brother Billy, who had disappeared 30 years ago. Billy, who had vanished without a trace. leaving behind only questions and a family too broken to search properly. Billy, who Hank had assumed was living somewhere else, maybe with a new name, maybe with a family of his own. Billy, who had been dead all this time. Hank's hand shook as he reached into the coffin, not to disturb the remains, but to retrieve the leather-bound journal that lay beside them. The journal was newer than the bones, protected from the elements by the coffin's construction. Someone had placed it there deliberately, meaning for it to be found. The leather was soft brown, well-maintained despite its age. No name was embossed on the cover, but when Hank opened it, his brother's familiar handwriting stared back at him from the first page. "Dear Hank," the entry began, "I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I had to try." The date at the top of the page was from 25 years ago. Hank's vision blurred as he read the first few lines, Billy's voice echoing in his memory even as his brother's bones lay silent before him. "I know you're angry," Billy had written. "I know you probably never want to see me again. But Hank, I need you to know that I never meant for things to go so wrong. Dad's death hit us all hard, and the will, well, I know how it looked to you, but you're my brother, and that means more than any piece of paper." Hank closed the journal, unable to read more. Not here, not now, with Billy's remains staring up at him like an accusation. He needed time to process this, space to understand what he was seeing, but first he needed to get Billy home. The thought came unbidden and felt absolutely right. Whatever had happened, wherever Billy had been all these years, he deserved better than this forgotten clearing. He deserved a proper burial, with family present and words spoken over his grave. Except Hank was the only family Billy had left, as far as he knew. Their parents had died years ago, and Billy had never married, at least not as far as Hank was aware. 30 years of silence made it hard to know anything for certain. Duke had crept closer while Hank wrestled with his thoughts, and now sat pressed against his side, offering wordless comfort. The dog's presence was grounding, a reminder that life continued even when the past reached up to grab you by the throat. Hank stood slowly, his knees protesting the movement. He was too old for revelations like this, too set in his ways to handle the complete upheaval of everything he thought. He knew, but Billy was his brother, and some obligations transcended personal comfort. He would need help moving the coffin, and that meant involving other people, something he'd avoided for decades. The thought made his stomach clench, but there was no alternative. Billy deserved dignity in death, even if their relationship in life had ended in bitterness and silence. The journal felt heavy in his hands, weighted with 30 years of unread words. How many letters had Billy written? How many times had his brother tried to reach across the chasm that Hank's pride had created? The walk back to where Jasper waited passed in a blur of conflicting emotions. Grief for the brother he'd lost without knowing it. Guilt for the years of silence that could never be reclaimed. Anger at whatever circumstances had led Billy to die alone in the wilderness. And underneath it all, a profound sadness for the relationship they'd never had the chance to repair. Jasper lifted his head as Hank approached, ears pricked forward with concern. Animals were sensitive to human emotion, and Hank's distress was probably radiating from him like heat from a forge. "We need to go to town, old boy," Hank told the horse as he mounted up. "Got some calls to make." The ride home passed in silence, broken only by the sound of hooves on stone and the whisper of wind through pine needles. Duke ranged alongside as always, but stayed closer than usual, as if sensing his human's need for comfort. Back at the cabin, Hank sat at his kitchen table, with Billy's journal unopened before him. The afternoon light slanted through the windows, casting long shadows across the worn wood floor. He'd been alone in this place for 30 years, but had never felt the solitude as keenly as he did now. Billy had been looking for him. That much was clear from the first journal entry, but how long had he searched? How close had he come to finding Hank before whatever tragedy claimed his life? The questions circled like buzzards, offering no answers, only more pain. But Hank knew he would read every word Billy had written. would follow his brother's thoughts through the years of separation and silence. It was the least he could do, and perhaps the most. Outside, the forest continued its ancient rhythms, indifferent to human grief. But in the small cabin where Hank Calloway had thought himself beyond the reach of the past, everything had changed. Billy was dead, had been dead for decades, and Hank was completely, utterly alone. Sleep eluded Hank that night, like a wild animal. Avoiding a trap, he lay in his narrow bed, staring at the ceiling while Duke's steady breathing provided the only sound in the cabin's oppressive silence. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Billy's bones arranged in that makeshift coffin, the red flannel shirt faded but unmistakable. At 3 a.m, he gave up the pretense and padded to the kitchen in his bare feet. The journal sat on, the table where he'd left it, leather cover worn smooth by handling. Billy's journal, Billy's thoughts, Billy's final messages to a brother who hadn't been there to receive them. Hank lit the oil lamp with shaking hands and settled into his chair. Duke appeared at his side, silent and supportive, settling his bulk against Hank's leg with a soft sigh. The dog had always been sensitive to human emotion, and the grief radiating from his master was impossible to ignore. The first entry was dated 25 years ago, written in Billy's careful script. Hank remembered how his brother had always taken pride in his penmanship, even as a boy. Their mother had insisted on proper letter formation, and Billy had been the obedient son who never questioned her rules. "Dear Hank," Billy had written, "I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I had to try. It's been 5 years since you left, and not a day goes by that I don't think about that last fight we had. I keep replaying it in my mind, wondering if I could have said something different, something that would have made you stay." Hank's throat tightened. 5 years. Billy had started writing these letters 5 years after Hank's departure, which meant his brother had spent half a decade hoping for reconciliation before finally putting pen to paper. "Sarah's pregnant," the entry continued. "I wanted you to know you're going to be an uncle. We're hoping for a boy, and if it is, I'd like to name him after you. I know that might seem strange, given everything that's happened, but you're still my brother. You'll always be my brother. Sarah." Billy had found someone, had fallen in love, had started a family. The knowledge hit Hank like a physical blow. While he'd been nursing his wounded pride in these mountains, Billy had been building a life, creating the kind of future they'd both dreamed about as children. Hank turned the page, hungry for more details about this life he'd missed entirely. Billy wrote about Sarah with obvious devotion, how they'd met at a church social, how she made him laugh, how she saw past the sadness he carried over his brother's absence. "She asks about you sometimes," Billy had written. "I tell her you were the best big brother a kid could ask for, always looking out for me, always making sure I was safe. She says she'd like to meet you someday. I tell her maybe, but I'm not sure I believe it anymore." The words cut deep, because they were so generous, so free of the bitterness Hank would have expected. Billy remembered their childhood differently than Hank did, or perhaps more completely. Where Hank carried guilt about his final angry words, Billy seemed to hold on to memories of better times. He flipped ahead several pages, scanning dates and entries. Billy had written regularly for years, sometimes daily, sometimes with weeks between entries. The journal chronicled the birth of his son, named Henry after Hank, and later a daughter called Emma. It documented family milestones, work struggles, small triumphs and larger disappointments, but threading through all of it was Billy's persistent hope that someday, somehow, they would find their way back to each other. Hank was deep in an entry about little Henry's first steps when something slipped from between the pages and fluttered to the floor. Duke's ears perked up as Hank bent to retrieve it, and what he found made his hands tremble. A photograph, old and faded, showed 2 boys standing beside a Christmas tree. Hank recognized the scene immediately. Their family's living room, decorated for Christmas, 1968. He was 12 in the picture, Billy 8, both of them grinning at the camera with gap-toothed smiles and eyes bright with holiday excitement. Their Father stood behind them, one hand on each boy's shoulder, wearing the flannel shirt he'd favored for special occasions. Their mother knelt beside them, beautiful even in the photograph's faded colors, her smile warm and proud as she looked at her boys. Hank stared at the image until his eyes burned. He'd forgotten how young they all looked, how hopeful. Their father had been only 35 then, strong and seemingly invincible. Their mother had been 32, with laugh lines just beginning to show around her eyes. They'd had no idea what was coming. The arguments over money, the fights about responsibility, the slow erosion of family bonds that would eventually tear them apart. In the photograph, Billy leaned against Hank's side with complete trust, the way younger brothers did when they believed their older siblings could protect them from anything. Hank had tried to live up to that faith for years, but had ultimately failed when it mattered most. He remembered taking Billy fishing that summer, teaching him to cast a line and wait patiently for the fish to bite. Billy had been terrible at fishing. Too eager, too talkative, too ready to give up when the fish didn't cooperate immediately. But he'd kept trying, because Hank was there to encourage him. "You just need practice," Hank had told him. "Everything worth doing takes practice." Billy had taken that advice to heart, in ways Hank was only beginning to understand. His brother had practiced patience through 5 years of silence before beginning these journal entries. He'd practiced hope through decades of searching and waiting. He'd practiced love through years of hurt and disappointment. Hank returned to the journal, reading with new hunger. Billy wrote about his children with the kind of detail that spoke of deep parental love. Henry was strong-willed like his uncle, quick to anger, but equally quick to forgive. Emma was gentler, more like her mother, with a gift for seeing the best in people even when they couldn't see it in themselves. "I tell them stories about you," Billy had written when the children were older, "about how you taught me to ride, how you stood up to Tommy Morrison when he was picking on me at school, how you always made sure I got the bigger piece of pie. I want them to know their uncle was a good man, even if they never get to meet him." The lamp flickered, casting dancing shadows across the journal's pages. Outside, the wind had picked up, setting the pine trees to whispering among themselves. Duke shifted position, but stayed close, maintaining his vigil over his grieving master. Hank read until dawn light began seeping through the cabin windows, following Billy's life through the pages of careful handwriting. His brother had worked construction, then moved into carpentry, eventually starting his own small business building custom furniture. He'd been successful enough to buy a house, to provide for his family, to put money aside for his children's education, but success hadn't filled the hole left by his brother's absence. That much was clear in every entry, underlying every happy moment Billy described. The love for his family was genuine and deep, but it couldn't entirely compensate for the relationship he'd lost. As morning light replaced the lamp's yellow glow, Hank closed the journal and looked again at the photograph. 4 people, frozen, in a moment of perfect happiness, unaware that within 20 years, 3 of them would be dead, and the 4th would be living like a hermit in the Montana wilderness. But Billy had tried to bridge that gap. Even from the grave, he was still trying. Duke stretched and yawned, ready for their morning routine. But today would be different from all the days that had come before. Today, Hank would continue reading, would follow his brother's journey through the years of separation and discover just how much love could endure. The second day brought no more sleep than the first. Hank found himself caught in the grip of an obsession he couldn't shake. Returning to Billy's journal, like a man dying of thirst returns to water. Each entry revealed another piece of the life he'd missed, another moment when his presence might have mattered. He read about Billy's wedding day, described in loving detail across several pages. Sarah had worn their mother's dress, altered to fit, but still carrying the weight of family tradition. Billy had stood at the altar thinking about how much he wished his brother could be there to serve as best man, a role he'd promised Hank when they were boys dreaming of their future families. The memory of that promise hit Hank like a physical blow. They'd been teenagers then, full of certainty about how their lives would unfold. Billy would marry his sweetheart, though he hadn't known her name yet, and Hank would stand beside him, proud and supportive. Hank would find love too, and Billy would return the favor, and their children would grow up together like cousins should. Instead, Hank had spent Billy's wedding day alone in these mountains, probably chopping wood or mending fence, blissfully, unaware that his brother was making vows to a woman he'd never meet. But it was the ring that truly undid him. Hank had noticed it in the coffin, catching the light even after all these years. But reading Billy's description of choosing it, of having it engraved, of sliding it onto Sarah's finger during their ceremony, made the simple band seem impossibly precious. "I had them engrave our initials inside," Billy had written, along with the date. BC and SM, forever and always, May 15th, 1978. Sarah laughed when she saw it, said I was being sentimental, but I wanted something that would last, something that would remind us both of this perfect day, even when we're old and grey. Billy had been 26 then, full of hope for a future that would stretch decades ahead. He'd believed in forever the way young men do, with complete faith that love could conquer any obstacle. He'd had no way of knowing that forever would be cut short, that he would die alone in the wilderness with that ring still on his finger. Hank set the journal aside and walked to the window, staring out at the forest that had hidden his brothers. Secret for so many years. Duke followed, pressing his warm bulk against Hank's leg in silent comfort. The dog seemed to understand that his master was walking through emotional territory that required careful navigation. The entries from Billy's early married years painted a picture of contentment that made Hank's chest ache. Small domestic details, Sarah's attempts at cooking, Billy's pride in his carpentry work, their excitement over buying their first house, revealed a life built on simple pleasures and shared dreams. When Henry was born, Billy's joy practically radiated from the pages. He described his son with the wonder of a first-time father, marveling at tiny fingers and the serious expression the baby wore while sleeping. But even in his happiness, Billy couldn't help thinking about his absent brother. "I wish you could see him, Hank," Billy had written when Henry was 6 months old. "He has your eyes, that same intense stare you used to get when you were concentrating on something. Sarah says he's going to be stubborn like his uncle. I hope she's right. I hope he grows up with your strength and your sense of right and wrong." The irony wasn't lost on Hank. While Billy was hoping his son would inherit his uncle's best qualities, Hank was living in isolation, convinced he'd failed his family so completely that he deserved nothing but solitude. Emma's birth 3 years later brought similar joy, tempered by Billy's growing concern about his brother's continued absence. The entries from that period revealed Billy's first tentative attempts to locate Hank, starting with letters sent to old friends and former co-workers. "No one seems to know where you went," Billy had written. "It's like you just vanished off the face of the earth. But I know you're out there somewhere, and I'm not giving up. These kids need to know their uncle, and you need to know them. They're amazing, Hank. You'd love them." As the children grew, Billy's entries became filled with stories that seemed designed for Hank's benefit. Henry's first words, Emma's first steps, school plays and birthday parties, and all the small moments that made up a family's life. Billy documented everything as if he was keeping a record for his brother's eventual return. The custody battle over their father's will came up repeatedly in the journal, but not in the way Hank expected. Instead of the anger and resentment Hank remembered, Billy's entries showed only confusion and hurt. "I never understood why you thought I wanted the ranch all to myself," Billy had written. "You were the one who loved working the land. I was always better with my hands, building things. I would have been happy to sell the place and split the money, but you were gone before we could talk about it." Hank closed his eyes, remembering that terrible day when their father's lawyer had read the will. Everything left to Billy as the younger son, the one who'd stayed home while Hank served in Vietnam. The one who'd been there during their father's final illness, while Hank was off seeing the world. He'd felt betrayed, forgotten, cast aside in favor of the son who'd never strayed far from home. The hurt had turned to anger, and anger had turned to words that couldn't be taken back. He'd accused Billy of manipulation, of playing the dutiful son while Hank was away serving his country. He'd said things that night that still made him wince 30 years later. Billy's response had been shock, then hurt, then desperate attempts at explanation. But Hank's pride was too wounded to listen. He'd packed his belongings and left that same night, driving aimlessly until his truck broke down in a small Montana town. By the time he'd decided to stay, the anger had cooled enough to reveal the shame underneath. The journal entries showed Billy's side of that terrible night with painful clarity. His brother had been genuinely confused by Hank's accusations, hurt by the suggestion that he'd somehow conspired to steal their father's legacy. "I kept thinking you'd come back once you'd had time to cool down," Billy had written. "I kept expecting to see your truck in the driveway, ready to sit down and work this out like we always did. But days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months, and I started to realize you weren't coming back." The pain in those words was palpable even decades later. Billy had been 23 then, suddenly responsible for their father's estate and desperate to maintain the relationship that mattered most to him. He'd made mistakes, certainly, but they were the mistakes of youth and inexperience, not malice. Duke whined softly, drawing Hank back from his memories. The dog was looking toward the door, probably ready for their afternoon ride, but Hank wasn't. Sure he could face the forest today. Wasn't sure he could ride past the clearing where Billy's coffin waited among the pines. Instead, he returned to the journal, forcing himself to continue reading, even though each page brought new revelations and new pain. Billy had hired a private investigator at one point, spending money the young family could ill afford on a professional search that turned up nothing. He'd driven to neighboring states on weekends, following rumors and false leads, always hoping the next tip would reunite him with his brother. "Sarah thinks I should let it go," Billy had written after one particularly fruitless trip. "She says you'll come back when you're ready, that I can't force it. But she doesn't understand. You're not just my brother, you're my best friend. We shared everything growing up. How do I just accept that you're gone forever?" The entry was dated 15 years after Hank's departure. 15 years of searching, of hoping, of refusing to give up on a relationship that had been severed by pride and misunderstanding. As the light faded outside his cabin windows, Hank realized he was crying, not the dramatic tears of fresh grief, but the steady, quiet weeping of a man confronting the full weight of his mistakes. Billy had never stopped loving him, never stopped hoping for reconciliation, never stopped believing that brothers could find their way back to each other. And Hank had been here all along, less than 50 miles away, building walls of isolation, and telling himself he was protecting everyone from his failures. The simple gold band on Billy's finger had represented hope. Hope for lasting love, hope for family, hope for forever. Even in death, that hope deserved some kind of answer. 3 days into Billy's journal, Hank found the letter that changed everything. It was tucked between pages near the middle of the journal, yellowed with age and folded with the kind of careful precision their father had brought to everything he did. The paper was thin, almost fragile, and bore their father's distinctive handwriting. The angular script of a man who'd left school at 14, but had taught himself to write with dignity. Hank's hands trembled as he unfolded it, recognizing immediately what he was looking at. The date at the top was from 3 days before their father's death, when the old man had been heavily sedated, but still occasionally lucid. Hank had been in Seattle then, working construction and visiting occasionally, but not present for those final crucial days. The letter was addressed to both sons. "My dear boys," it began, and Hank had to stop reading to compose himself. He could hear his father's voice in those words, the gravelly tone, worn down by years of cigarettes and hard living, but still carrying the authority that had shaped both boys' childhoods. "If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you're probably trying to make sense of the mess I've left behind. I know the will is going to cause problems between you two, and that's the last thing your mother would have wanted. She always said you boys were stronger together than apart, and she was right about most things. Duke shifted beside Hank's chair, sensing the tension radiating from his master. The dog had barely left Hank's side since the discovery of Billy's. Coffin, maintaining a vigilant watch over a man who seemed to be coming apart at the seams. The truth is, the letter continued, I never meant for the ranch to go to just one of you. I always planned to split everything 50-50, the way your mother and I discussed before she passed. But then I got sick, and the lawyers kept talking about tax implications and legal complications, and somehow I let them convince me it would be simpler to leave everything to Billy, since he was here, and you were off seeing the world. Hank's vision blurred. Simple. It had been a matter of legal convenience, not favoritism. Not a judgment about which son had been more deserving or more loyal. Just an old man's attempt to avoid complications for his surviving children. I knew it was wrong as soon as I signed the papers, their father had written. Kept meaning to change it back, but then the cancer got worse, and I didn't have the energy to fight with lawyers anymore. I figured I could explain it to you boys, make sure you worked it out fair and square, but now it looks like I'm running out of time. The letter detailed their father's final wishes with painful clarity. Billy was to inherit the ranch and all its assets, but with the explicit understanding that half belonged to Hank. The two brothers were supposed to sit down together, work out what was fair, and divide their inheritance according to their individual needs and desires. Hank, you never wanted to ranch full-time, and that's fine, the letter continued. You got your mother's wandering spirit, always looking for the next horizon. But this land has been in our family for 3 generations, and it should provide for both my sons, whether that means working it or selling it or finding some other arrangement that suits you both. Their father had known his sons well enough to predict the potential for conflict. The letter included specific instructions for handling the division, appraisals, legal documentation, even suggestions for which parcels might appeal to which son. It was the work of a man who'd spent his final days trying to prevent exactly the kind of misunderstanding that had driven Hank away. Billy, I'm counting on you to make sure your brother gets his fair share, the letter concluded. And Hank, I'm counting on you to remember that your brother loves you and would never try to cheat you out of what's rightfully yours. You boys are family, and family takes care of family. Don't let pride or stubbornness break what your mother and I spent our whole lives building. Hank set the letter down and stared at the wall, his mind reeling. Billy had received this letter after their father's death, had read these instructions about sharing the inheritance, had probably tried to reach out to Hank to discuss the arrangements. But by then, Hank was already gone, driven away by wounded pride and a fundamental misunderstanding of their father's intentions. He flipped through Billy's journal to the entries from that period, looking for references to the letter. He found them quickly, page after page of Billy's increasing desperation as he tried to contact his absent brother. Got Dad's letter today, Billy had written. Now I understand why you were so angry. But Hank, you don't understand the whole situation. Dad never meant to cut you out. He wanted us to work together to decide what was fair for both of us. I've been trying to call you, but your phone's been disconnected. Mrs. Patterson at the post office says you haven't picked up your mail in weeks. Where did you go? The entries that followed documented Billy's frantic attempts to locate his brother. He'd driven to Hank's last known address, only to find the apartment empty. He'd contacted Hank's former employer, who confirmed that Hank had quit without providing a forwarding address. He'd even reached out to veterans organizations, hoping someone might have information about his brother's whereabouts. All while Hank was driving aimlessly through the Northwest, too angry and hurt to consider that there might be more to the story than what he'd seen in that lawyer's office. I've made a decision, Billy had written 3 months after their father's death. Since I can't find Hank to discuss this with him, I'm going to do what I think Dad would want. I'm selling the ranch, and putting half the money in trust for my brother. When he's ready to come home, it'll be waiting for him." The words hit Hank like a physical blow. Billy had sold their family's land, the ranch that had been in the Calloway family for 3 generations, because he believed it was the right thing to do. He'd walked away from his own heritage to honor their father's wishes and protect his brother's interests. "I kept one piece," Billy had written. "The 40 acres where Mom and Dad are buried. Figured that should stay in the family no matter what. But the rest is gone, and honestly, I'm relieved. I was never cut out to be a rancher anyway. Sarah and I are going to use my half to buy a house in town, maybe start the cabinet-making business I've been dreaming about, and Hank's half will be there when he needs it." Hank forced himself to read every entry from that period, following Billy's careful documentation of the property sale and the establishment of the trust fund. His brother had worked with lawyers and accountants to ensure everything was legal and protected, that Hank's inheritance would be safe even if Billy died before his brother returned. "I visit the graves every Sunday," Billy had written 6 months after the sale. "Tell Mom and Dad about Sarah and the baby we're hoping for. Tell them I'm still looking for you, still hoping you'll come home. Mom always said family was the most important thing in the world. I won't give up on ours." The trust fund documentation was tucked between journal pages like the letter had been. Legal paper showing that Billy had deposited exactly half the ranch's sale price into an account, bearing Hank's name. Interest had been accumulating for 30 years, turning what had been a substantial sum into something approaching a fortune. Hank stood abruptly, pacing to the window as Duke watched with concerned eyes. Outside, the forest looked the same as always, but everything had changed. Billy hadn't stolen anything. He'd sacrificed his own inheritance to do right by a brother who'd vanished without explanation. He'd honored their father's wishes even when it cost him the family land. And Hank had spent 30 years nursing a grievance based on complete misunderstanding. The guilt was overwhelming, a physical weight that seemed to press down on his chest. Until breathing became difficult, Billy had tried to do the right thing, had tried to find him, had tried to explain. And Hank had been unreachable, hidden away in these mountains, building walls around his wounded pride, while his brother spent decades searching for him. Duke whined softly and padded over to press against Hank's legs, offering comfort the only way he knew how. The dog's loyalty was simple and uncomplicated, untainted by the kind of pride that had destroyed Hank's relationship with his family. Billy's journal lay open on the table, filled with 30 years of love and loss and hope. Somewhere in Billings, if she was still alive, Sarah was probably still tending Billy's memory, still wondering what had happened to the brother-in-law she'd never met. And somewhere in a bank vault, Hank's inheritance was still waiting, a testament to Billy's faith that someday, somehow, his brother would come home. The drive to Timber Creek felt like traveling through a different world. Hank hadn't made the trip in 6 months, and his hands gripped the steering wheel of his old Ford with white-knuckled intensity. Duke sat in the passenger seat, sensing his master's nervous energy and offering quiet companionship for the 40-mile journey down the winding mountain road. The town hadn't changed much in the decades Hank had been making these semi-annual supply runs. Main Street still boasted the same weathered storefronts, the same faded signs advertising hardware and groceries, and the kind of services small communities needed to survive. But today, Hank saw it all through different eyes, as a place where people connected with each other, where families stayed in touch, where brothers didn't disappear for 30 years without explanation. The library sat at the end of Main Street, a modest brick building that doubled as the town's community center. Hank had never been inside, having no need for books or computers or the kind of social interaction the place represented. But Billy's journal had given him a hunger for information that couldn't be satisfied by isolation. Mrs. Henderson was behind the circulation desk, just as she'd been behind the counter at the general store for the past 15 years. She looked up as Hank entered, her expression shifting from polite professional interest to genuine surprise. Hank Calloway, she said, her voice warm despite the unusual circumstances. I haven't seen you since spring. What brings you to the library? Hank stood awkwardly in the doorway, suddenly aware of how out of place he must look. His clothes were clean but worn, his beard untrimmed, his entire appearance that of a man who'd forgotten how to interact with civilization. I need to find someone, he said finally. Family in Billings. Mrs. Henderson's expression softened. She was in her 60s, old enough to remember when the Calloway brothers were young men with their whole lives ahead of them. Old enough to know that sometimes family connections required more than pride allowed. Come sit down, she said, gesturing to a chair beside her desk. Tell me what you need. The story came out in halting sentences, edited and sanitized, but essentially true. A brother he'd lost touch with years ago, a need to reconnect to find out what had happened to Billy's family. Hank didn't mention the coffin in the woods or the journal full of unsent letters, but Mrs. Henderson seemed to understand that this was more than casual curiosity. Billy Calloway, she said thoughtfully. I remember him. Nice young man, married a teacher from Billings. Sarah something. They used to come through town occasionally when they were visiting your parents' graves. The confirmation that Billy's family had maintained that connection hit Hank harder than he'd expected. While he'd been hiding in the mountains, his brother had been honoring their parents' memory, probably bringing his children to see where their grandparents were buried. Let's see what we can find, Mrs. Henderson said, leading him to a computer terminal. The obituary databases might have information about recent deaths, and the phone directories could help us locate current addresses. The search took an hour, with Mrs. Henderson patiently explaining how to navigate databases and directories that might as well have been written in a foreign language for all the sense they made to Hank. But gradually, a picture emerged of Billy's family and their current circumstances. Sarah Calloway, now 64, was listed in the Billings directory at an address on the south side of town. No mention of remarriage, which meant she'd kept Billy's name even. After all these years, the phone number was current, according to the most recent directory. Henry Hank Calloway, 35, was employed as a high school history teacher in the Billings school district. Married to a woman named Jennifer, father of 2 children. Emma Calloway Morrison, 32, worked as a registered nurse at Billings General Hospital. Also married, with 1 child listed in the family records. Looks like you're a great uncle, Mrs. Henderson said gently. Billy built quite a family. The knowledge should have been comforting, but it only deepened Hank's sense of loss. 3 generations of family he'd never met, never acknowledged, never even known existed. While he'd been living like a hermit, Billy's children had grown up, gotten married, started families of their own. Mrs. Henderson wrote down the contact information on a piece of paper, her handwriting careful and clear. Will you call them? Hank stared at the phone number like it was a coiled snake. 30 years of silence couldn't be bridged with a simple phone call. What would he say? How could he explain where he'd been, why he'd never tried to make contact? I don't know, he admitted. Sometimes the hardest thing about making a call is picking up the phone, Mrs. Henderson said. After that, the words usually come. Back at the cabin that evening, Hank sat at his kitchen table with the paper in front of him and his old rotary phone within reach. Duke lay beside his chair, providing silent moral support for a task that seemed impossible. He dialed the number twice and hung up before the first ring. The third time, he let it connect, his heart hammering as the phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Hello? A woman's voice, older, but still strong, with the kind of warmth that spoke of someone accustomed to welcoming calls from family and friends. Hank opened his mouth and no words came out. After 30 years of near silence, his voice had simply abandoned him at the crucial moment. Hello? Sarah said again, more questioning now. Is someone there? Hank managed, then stopped. How? Did you introduce yourself to a woman who'd been married to your brother for decades, who'd raised children you'd never met, who probably thought you were dead? The silence stretched until Sarah spoke again, her tone becoming concerned. If this is some kind of emergency, please say something. Hank hung up, Duke lifted his head, amber eyes questioning. The dog had watched the entire failed attempt at communication, and his expression seemed almost human in its understanding and sympathy. "I'm not good at this, boy," Hank said, scratching behind Duke's ears. "Been alone too long." The dog's response was to rest his head on Hank's lap, offering comfort without judgment. Duke had never known any human besides Hank, had never experienced the kind of family connections that Billy's journal described. But his loyalty was absolute, his trust complete. That trust made Hank think of something he'd carried for 40 years without really understanding its significance. He went to his bedroom and opened the small wooden box where he kept his few valuables, his father's watch, his mother's wedding ring, and the dog tags from his time in Vietnam. The metal discs were tarnished with age but still legible. Calloway, Henry J., followed by his service number and blood type. He'd worn them through 2 tours of duty, through the chaos and confusion of a war that had shaped his entire generation. They'd been a part of him for so long that taking them off after discharge had felt like losing a piece of his identity. He returned to the kitchen and knelt beside Duke, who watched with curious interest as Hank worked the chain over the dog's head. The tag settled against Duke's chest, catching the lamplight. "These mean something," Hank said quietly. "They mean you belong somewhere, that someone cares whether you come home safe. I want you to have them." Duke's tail wagged slowly, as if he understood the significance of the gesture. The tags were too big for him, designed for human necks, but they rested comfortably against his fur, a visible symbol of the bond between man and dog. The phone sat silent on the table, Sarah's number still written on the paper beside it. Tomorrow, Hank promised himself. Tomorrow he would find the courage to complete the call, to bridge the gap that pride and misunderstanding had created. But for now, it was enough to sit with Duke and feel the weight of family obligations settling on his shoulders like a long-forgotten coat. Billy's journal lay open beside him, filled with love letters to a brother who'd been too proud to come home. Outside, the Montana wilderness continued its ancient rhythms, indifferent to human struggles with connection and forgiveness. But inside the small cabin, something was shifting. The isolation that had once felt like protection was beginning to feel like imprisonment, and Duke, wearing Hank's dog tags like a badge of belonging, seemed to understand that change was coming, whether his master was ready for it or not. The compass was tucked into the very back of Billy's journal, wrapped in a piece of old cloth and secured with string that had been tied with the kind of careful knots their grandfather had taught them both as boys. Hank almost missed it, focused as he was on reading the final entries that documented Billy's last months of life. When his fingers found the small, hard object, he unwrapped it with trembling hands and felt his world shift entirely. It was there. Grandfather's compass, the one that had guided 3 generations of Calloway men through the Montana wilderness. Brass and steel, worn smooth by decades of handling, with the initials J.C. engraved on the back for Jacob Calloway, who'd carried it west in 1889. Their father had given it to Billy when he turned 18, following family tradition that passed the compass to the eldest son. But Hank was the eldest son, a fact that had always bothered him, even though he'd tried not to show it. The compass should have been his. Would have been his if their father hadn't been trying to make up for all the years Billy had stayed home while Hank explored the world. Now, holding the familiar weight in his palm, Hank realized Billy had been trying to return it to its rightful owner. The final journal entries told the story with devastating clarity. Billy had spent the last 5 years of his life working with private investigators, following leads and rumors, slowly narrowing down the search area where his brother might be living. The entries read like a treasure hunt, full of false starts and dead ends and moments of crushing disappointment. But gradually, methodically, Billy had closed in on the truth. The investigator thinks he's found something, Billy had written in an entry dated just 3 months before his death. A hermit living on government land up near Glacier National Park. Pays his taxes to a Timber Creek address. Matches Hank's. Description keeps to himself. Could be nothing, but it's the best lead we've had in years. Hank's hands shook as he read his brother's growing excitement in the subsequent entries. Billy had driven to Timber Creek, had spoken with Mrs. Henderson. At the general store, had pieced together a picture of the reclusive man who came to town twice a year for supplies. She couldn't tell me much, Billy had written, but what she did say sounds like Hank. Same age, same build, same way of keeping to himself that he had even as a kid when he was thinking hard about something. She said he lives up in the mountains, with just a dog for company. That sounds like my brother. The investigation had taken months of careful, patient work. Billy had hiked the mountain trails on weekends, learning the area, talking to forest rangers and hunters, and anyone else who might have encountered the mysterious hermit. He'd been methodical about it, the same way he'd been methodical about everything in his life. I think I found his cabin. Read an entry from 6 weeks before Billy's death. Talked to a forest ranger who mentioned seeing smoke from a chimney in a valley about 10 miles north of the main trail. He said there's been someone living up there for decades, completely legal, keeps to the seasonal restrictions, and doesn't cause any problems. Tomorrow I'm going to hike up there and see for myself. Hank could barely breathe as he read about Billy's first reconnaissance trip. His brother had gotten close enough to see the cabin through binoculars, had watched Hank himself emerge to tend to his horse, had seen Duke playing in the clearing, had noted the careful way Hank moved around his property. It's him, Billy had written in triumph. It's really him. 30 years older and a lot more grey, but it's definitely Hank. He looks tired, lonely, but he's alive and he's healthy, and I finally found him. The next entries detailed Billy's careful planning for a reunion. He'd wanted to approach slowly, to give Hank time to adjust to the idea of contact. He'd considered writing a letter first, but decided that face-to-face conversation would be better. Too much had been left unsaid for too many years. I'm going to hike up there next week, Billy had written. Sarah thinks I should call first, but what if he hangs up? What if he runs again? I need to see his face when I explain about Dad's letter, about the trust fund, about everything. I need him to know that I never stopped loving him. The final entry was dated the day Billy died, written in the morning before he set out on his final hike. This is it, Billy had written. Today I'm going to see my brother for the first time in 30 years. I've been practicing what I'll say, but I suspect the words will come when I need them. I'm bringing Grandpa's compass. Hank always loved it more than I did, and I want him to have it. It seems right that it should guide him home, the way it guided Grandpa all those years ago. The entry continued with Billy's hopes for their reunion, his dreams of introducing Hank to his grandchildren, his plans for rebuilding the relationship that had meant everything to him as a child. I know he'll be angry at first, Billy had written. Probably hurt that I tracked him down when he clearly wanted to be left alone. But underneath all that, he's still my big brother, still the man who taught me to fish and ride and stand up for myself. I have to believe that love is stronger than pride, that family matters more than whatever drove him away. The journal ended. There, mid-sentence, as if Billy had been interrupted by something, probably the need to start his hike while the weather was still good. Hank set the journal aside and stared at the compass, its needle pointing steadily north toward the peaks that dominated the horizon. Billy had been carrying this when he died, had been hiking through the forest with their grandfather's compass in his pocket and love in his heart. The newspaper clipping was folded inside the journal's back cover, a brief obituary from the Billings Gazette. William Billy Calloway, 53, died October 15th of an apparent heart attack while hiking in Glacier National Park. He was discovered by forest rangers after his family reported him missing. Services will be held October 15th. Hank checked his own records, the simple calendar where he marked supply trips and routine maintenance. He'd been chopping wood that day, preparing for winter. While Billy was dying less than 2 miles from The cabin. Hank had been going about his daily routine, completely unaware that his brother was so close, 2 miles. Billy had made it within 2 miles of the reunion he'd spent years planning. If he'd started an hour earlier, if he'd taken a slightly different trail, if his heart had held out for another 30 minutes of hiking, he would have walked into that clearing and found his brother. The weight of that knowledge was crushing. All those years of Billy searching, hoping, planning, and he died within sight of his goal. All those years of Hank hiding, avoiding, running from connections, and he'd been safe in his isolation while his brother's heart gave out on a mountain trail. Hank looked around his cabin with new eyes, seeing it suddenly as the fortress of selfishness it had always been. While Billy was building a family, creating connections, honoring their parents' memory and their father's wishes, Hank had been here feeling sorry for himself. Duke appeared at his side, sensing the crisis building. In his master, the dog's presence was grounding, a reminder that loyalty didn't require explanations or justifications. Duke had simply chosen to stay, to trust, to love without conditions. Billy had made the same choice for 30 years. The compass felt warm in Hank's palm, as if it retained some echo of Billy's touch. Their grandfather had used it to navigate unknown territory, to find his way through wilderness toward the promise of a better life. Now it was Hank's turn to use it for navigation. But the territory he needed to cross wasn't geographical. He had to call Sarah, had to complete the journey Billy had started, had to honor his brother's memory by doing what Billy would have done if their positions had been reversed, reaching across the gap that pride had created and rebuilding the family connections that mattered more than anything else. Billy had died trying to come home. Now it was Hank's turn to make that journey, to carry his brother's love back to the family that had never stopped waiting for both Calloway brothers to find their way home. The phone sat on the kitchen table. Sarah's number still written on the paper beside it. This time Hank wouldn't hang up. This time he would find the words to bridge 30 years of silence. He owed Billy that much. He owed himself that much. And somewhere in the forest, in a moss-covered coffin among the pines, Billy was still waiting for his brother to come home. The land deed was tucked inside an envelope at the very bottom of Billy's box of documents, yellow with age and marked with the official seal of the county assessor's office. Hank almost didn't open it, assuming it was just another piece of paperwork related to the ranch sale. But something about the careful way it had been preserved made him look closer. When he unfolded the document, his name stared back at him from legal language that took several readings to understand. The deed was for his current property, the 40 acres where his cabin sat, the land he'd been living on for 30 years under what he'd assumed was a federal lease agreement. But according to the deed, Henry James Calloway was the legal owner of the property, had been the legal owner since 1995, when someone had purchased it from the government on his behalf. The tax records were attached, showing 30 years of payments made by William Calloway on behalf of his brother. Billy had been protecting Hank's home, ensuring he could never be forced to leave, providing the security that isolation required, while never expecting thanks or recognition. Hank sank into his kitchen chair, overwhelmed by this final revelation of his brother's generosity. Even after 30 years of silence, Billy had been watching over him, making sure he was safe. The hermit's paradise that Hank had built wasn't really his at all. It was a gift from the brother he'd abandoned. Duke padded over and rested his massive head on Hank's knee, amber eyes full of concern. The dog tags Hank had given him caught the lamplight, a reminder of bonds that transcended understanding. "He never gave up on me, boy," Hank whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "Not once in 30 years. The phone call couldn't be delayed any longer. Billy had died trying to complete a journey that was now Hank's responsibility. But 30 years of silence couldn't be broken with a simple explanation, and Hank had no experience with the kind of conversation that lay ahead. He spent the morning practicing what he would say, writing notes on scraps of paper and throwing them away when the words seemed inadequate. How did you apologize for 3 decades of absence? How did you explain pride so stubborn it had survived longer than the anger that created it? By afternoon, he'd filled a notebook with draft conversations, each one sounding more hollow than the last. Sarah deserved better than rehearsed speeches. She deserved the truth, messy and painful as it might be. The first attempt lasted 3 rings before Hank lost his nerve and hung up. The second made it to Sarah's hello before his voice abandoned him entirely. By the third try, he was shaking so badly that Duke whined in sympathy. "This isn't working," Hank said aloud, pushing the phone away. "I need help." The drive to Timber Creek felt like a retreat, but Mrs. Henderson welcomed him with the same warmth she'd shown before. When he explained his difficulty making contact with Billy's family, her expression softened with understanding. "Sometimes," she said gently, "the hardest conversations require a little preparation. Would it help if I made the initial contact, explained who you are, and asked if Sarah would be willing to speak with you?" The offer was tempting, but Hank shook his head. "Billy walked into those mountains to find me himself. The least I can do is make the call myself." "Then perhaps you're approaching this wrong," Mrs. Henderson said. "You're trying to explain 30 years in one phone call. Maybe you should start smaller. Maybe you should visit Billy first." The suggestion hit him like a revelation. Of course, Billy's grave would be in Billings, probably in the same cemetery where their parents were buried. Before he tried to reconnect with the living, he should pay his respects to the dead. "Do you know which cemetery?" Hank asked. Mrs. Henderson consulted her computer, accessing records that Hank couldn't begin to navigate alone. "Sunset Memorial Gardens," she said after a few minutes. "Same place as your parents. Looks like the family has a plot there." The drive to Billings took 3 hours through mountain passes that reminded Hank of every mile he'd put between himself and his family. Duke rode in the passenger seat, providing silent companionship for a journey that felt like pilgrimage. Sunset Memorial Gardens sat on a hillside overlooking the city, with rows of headstones stretching toward distant mountains. Hank had been here once before for his mother's funeral, but that was 40 years ago, and his memories were hazy with grief and youth. The office staff was helpful in a way that suggested they dealt regularly with people searching for lost family connections. Billy's grave was in Section C, Row 15, not far from where their parents rested. The plot included space for Sarah when her time came, a final testament to a love that had lasted despite loss. Hank stood at the foot of Billy's grave for a long time, reading the simple headstone that bore his brother's name, dates, and a single line: "Beloved husband, father, and brother." The word brother hit him like a physical blow. Even in death, Billy had claimed their relationship. "I'm sorry," Hank said aloud, his voice carried away by the wind that swept down from the mountains. "I'm sorry I wasn't there. Sorry I didn't answer your letters. Sorry I let pride matter more than family." The words felt inadequate, but they were a start. Duke sat beside the grave with unusual solemnity, as if he understood the significance of this place and this moment. "I found your journal," Hank continued. "Read every word. Found the compass and Dad's letter and all the documents. I know what you tried to do, what you did do. I know you never stopped looking for me." A groundskeeper worked nearby, tending to other graves with the kind of quiet respect that suggested long experience with grief. When he noticed Hank, he approached with cautious friendliness. "You family?" the man asked. "Brother," Hank said, the word feeling strange after so many years. "Billy was a good man," the groundskeeper said. "Came here regular with his wife and kids. Always brought flowers, always spent time telling the children stories about their grandparents. He talked about you sometimes, said he had a brother up in the mountains who'd come home when he was ready." The casual revelation that Billy had spoken of him had maintained hope for their reunion, even in conversations with strangers, brought fresh tears to Hank's eyes. "He never gave up," the groundskeeper continued. "Even when his wife worried that maybe you didn't want to be found, Billy always said family was family. Said his brother would come home when the time was right." After the groundskeeper moved on, Hank knelt beside Billy's headstone and placed his hand on the sun-warmed granite. "I'm here now," he whispered. "I'm ready to come home." The drive through Billings to Sarah's neighborhood took him past schools where his nephew might have taught, the hospital where his niece worked, playgrounds where his great-nieces and nephews might have played. This was Billy's world, the life he'd built while Hank was hiding in the mountains. Sarah's house sat on a quiet street, lined with mature trees and well-maintained lawns. It was the kind of neighborhood where families raised children and grandparents, visited for Sunday dinners. The kind of place Hank had never allowed himself to imagine belonging to. The house itself was modest but welcoming, with a front porch that showed signs of regular use and flower beds that spoke of patient care. Billy's influence was visible in the custom woodwork around the windows and the hand-built planters that bordered the walkway. Hank sat in his truck for 20 minutes, gathering courage for the conversation that would either restore his family or confirm that some bridges couldn't be rebuilt. Duke waited patiently, understanding somehow that this was important work that required careful approach. Finally, with his brother's compass in his pocket and 30 years of silence weighing on his shoulders, Hank walked to Sarah's front door. The doorbell echoed inside the house, followed by the sound of footsteps approaching. Through the window beside the door, he caught a glimpse of a woman with silver hair and kind eyes, moving with the careful grace of someone who'd learned to navigate life's hardships. When she opened the door, her expression was politely questioning until she saw his face. The recognition was instant and shocking. Sarah's hand flew to her throat, her eyes widening with something between hope and disbelief. "Oh my God," she whispered. "You're Hank." The words hung in the air between them, carrying 30 years of questions and the weight of Billy's unfulfilled dreams. Behind Sarah, family photographs lined the hallway, images of weddings and graduations and birthday celebrations that Hank had missed entirely. But in the woman's eyes, he saw an echo of Billy's generosity, the same willingness to believe that family connections could survive even the longest separations. "I am," Hank said simply, "and I think we need to talk." The flowers were simple. White daisies from the grocery store near the cemetery, wrapped in plain paper that crinkled in the mountain wind. Hank had never been one for elaborate gestures, but standing at Billy's grave empty-handed felt like another failure in a lifetime full of them. He'd driven past the florist twice before settling on the grocery store display, paralyzed by choices he'd never had to make. What flowers said, "I'm sorry," for 30 years of silence? What arrangement could possibly express the weight of regret he carried? In the end, he'd chosen the daisies because Billy had always loved simple things, honest things. Their mother had grown daisies in her garden, and both boys had spent summer afternoons lying in the grass, looking up at clouds and making plans for futures that had never come to pass. Now Hank knelt beside his brother's headstone, placing the flowers against the polished granite with hands that shook despite his efforts at control. Duke sat nearby, unusually still, as if he understood the solemnity of this moment. "I brought you something," Hank said to the stone, his voice barely audible above the wind. "Should have brought flowers years ago. Should have brought myself years ago." The cemetery stretched around them in quiet rows, marked by lives lived and lost, relationships honored and mourned. In the distance, the mountains rose like sleeping giants, indifferent to human grief, but somehow comforting in their permanence. "I read your journal," Hank continued, the words coming easier now. "Every page, every letter you never sent. I found Dad's letter too, and the compass. Found out about the trust fund, about how you paid my taxes all these years. Billy, His voice broke on his brother's name. 30 years of unspoken words, finally finding their way into the world. A groundskeeper worked among distant graves, giving him privacy for this overdue conversation with the dead. "I was wrong," Hank said finally. "About everything. About the will. About Dad's intentions. About what family means. I let pride poison everything good between us, and I can't fix that now. but I can try to honor what you were trying to do." The daisies looked small against the headstone, inadequate for the size of his regret, but they were present, visible proof that Billy's brother had finally come to pay his respects. It was a beginning, however late. "Tell me about Sarah," Hank said, settling cross-legged on the grass like they used to do as children. "Tell me about your kids. Tell me everything I missed." The conversation was one-sided, of course, but Hank found himself speaking as if Billy could hear every word. He told his brother about the cabin, about Duke, about the 30 years of solitude that had seemed like safety until loneliness became a weight too heavy to carry alone. The groundskeeper approached eventually, a man in his 60s with kind eyes and dirt under his fingernails. He carried flowers of his own, fresh roses for a nearby grave, and moved with the careful respect of someone who understood that cemeteries were sacred ground. "You family?" he asked when he noticed Hank's presence. "Brother," Hank said, the word still strange on his tongue. "Billy was special people," the groundskeeper said, settling into conversation with the ease of someone accustomed to providing comfort to the grieving. "His wife still comes every week, brings fresh flowers and sits here talking to him like he's gonna answer back." The image of Sarah maintaining this vigil hit Hank harder than he'd expected. While he'd been hiding in the mountains, Billy's widow had been here every week, keeping faith with a love that transcended death. "She ever mentioned me?" Hank asked. "Matter of fact, she did," the groundskeeper said. "Always wondered about Billy's brother, hoped maybe someday you'd come around. She'd say, when Hank's ready, he'll find his way home." Real patient lady, that one. Patient, like Billy had been patient, waiting decades for a reconciliation that never came. Like their father had been patient, trusting his sons to work out their differences. Like family was supposed to be patient, giving love time to overcome pride. "You planning to see her?" the groundskeeper asked. "Thinking about it," Hank admitted. "She's got Billy's heart," the man said simply, "which means she's got room for family, even family that's been away too long." After the groundskeeper moved on, Hank spent another hour at Billy's grave, talking through 30 years of isolation and regret. He told his brother about Duke's loyalty, about the slow realization that solitude wasn't strength, but fear. He promised to take care of Sarah if she'd let him, to get to know the children Billy had raised, to try to become the uncle he should have been all along. When he finally stood to leave, his knees protested the long vigil, but something had shifted. During those hours beside Billy's grave, the weight of guilt remained, but it was joined now by purpose. Billy had died trying to reach him, and Hank would complete that journey by reaching out to the family his brother had cherished. The drive to Sarah's neighborhood took him through streets lined with memories he'd never made, past the elementary school where Henry and Emma had probably attended classes, past parks where they'd played, past the everyday landmarks of a life lived in community rather than isolation. Sarah's house sat back from the street, surrounded by the kind of garden that spoke of years of patient tending. Roses climbed a trellis beside the front porch, and flower beds showed the careful planning of someone who understood that beauty required both vision and maintenance. Billy's influence was everywhere, in the custom shutters, the hand-built porch, swing, the attention to detail that marked a craftsman's work. This was the home he'd created for his family, the sanctuary where he'd raised children and dreamed of the day his brother might visit. Hank sat in his truck for a long time, studying the house and gathering courage for the conversation ahead. Duke waited patiently in the passenger seat, understanding somehow that this moment required careful preparation. Through the front window, he could see movement inside. A woman with silver hair moving through rooms that held 30 years of family life. Photographs lined the mantel, probably chronicling birthdays and holidays and all the celebrations Hank had missed. When Sarah appeared at the kitchen window, Hank's breath caught. Even across the distance and through glass, her resemblance to Billy was unmistakable. The same gentle eyes, the same patient expression that suggested someone accustomed to looking for the best in difficult situations. She was watering plants, on the windowsill, moving with the careful grace of someone who'd learned to find meaning in daily rituals. This was Billy's Sarah, the woman who'd loved his brother enough to wait for a reunion that would never come. Finally, with his brother's compass in his pocket and 30 years of silence weighing on his shoulders, Hank stepped out of his truck and walked toward the front door. Each step felt like crossing decades, bridging the gap between isolation and family, between pride and love. When he knocked, the sound echoed through the house like a promise finally being kept. Sarah's initial reaction was everything Hank had feared and expected. The shock in her eyes gave way quickly to something harder. Anger that had been building for 30 years, hurt that had been carefully buried beneath the demands of daily life. 30 years, she said, her voice shaking with emotion she'd probably never allowed herself to express. 30 years, Hank. Do you have any idea what your disappearance did to him, to all of us? Hank stood on her porch, hat in hand, feeling every one of his 68 years. Behind Sarah, he could see family photographs covering every surface, Billy with children, grandchildren, holiday celebrations and birthday parties, a lifetime of joy he'd chosen to miss. I know, he said quietly. I know I can't make up for lost time, but I need to tell you about Billy, about how I found him. The mention of her husband's name seemed to break something loose in Sarah's composure. She stepped back, gesturing him inside with the kind of automatic politeness that came from decades of gracious living. He never stopped talking about you, she said, leading him to a living room that felt like a shrine to family life. Even at the end, even when the doctor said his heart was failing, he was planning another trip to find you. The pain in her voice was raw, unhealed after all these years. Hank settled into the chair she indicated, acutely aware of how out of place he looked in this warm, family-centered space. He found me, Hank said gently. Not in the way he planned, but he found me. Sarah's eyes sharpened with interest and fear. What do you mean? Hank told her about the coffin in the woods, about Billy's journal filled with 30 years of unsent letters. He explained about their father's final letter, about the trust fund Billy had established, about the compass and the land deed, and all the ways his brother had protected him without expecting anything in return. He died trying to reach me, Hank said, his voice breaking on the words. He was hiking to my cabin when his heart gave out. He was 2 miles away, Sarah, 2 miles from the reunion he'd planned for so long. Sarah pressed her hands to her mouth, tears streaming down her cheeks. He was so excited that last morning, she whispered, kept checking his pack, talking about how surprised you'd be to see him. I begged him to call first, but he said some conversations had to happen face to face. They sat in silence for a long moment, sharing grief that had different sources but the same depth. Outside, the afternoon light slanted through windows that framed a life Hank had never been part of. Why? Sarah asked finally. Why did you stay away so long? Billy tried everything to find you, to explain about your father's will. We sent letters, hired investigators, even put notices in newspapers. It was like you disappeared completely. Hank told her about the argument, about his wounded pride, about the years of isolation that had started as punishment and become habit. He told her about Duke, about the cabin, about the slow realization that he'd built his life around, avoiding the very connections that might have saved him. I was wrong, he said simply, about everything, but especially about Billy. He was the better man, the better brother. He deserved so much more than I gave him. Sarah studied his face with the kind of careful attention that came from 30 years of loving a Calloway man. Whatever she saw there seemed to soften her anger, replacing it with something closer to compassion. He loved you, she said finally, more than his own pride, more than his hurt feelings. He used to tell the children stories about their Uncle Hank, about how brave you were, how you taught him everything important. He made you real for them, even though they'd never met you. The knowledge that Billy had kept his memory alive for his children hit Hank like a physical blow. While he'd been nursing his grievances in isolation, his brother had been building a legacy of love that included the brother who'd abandoned him. "I have something for you," Sarah said, rising and moving to a small desk in the corner. She returned with an envelope, yellowed with age, that bore Hank's name in Billy's familiar handwriting. "He wrote this the night before he died," she said, placing it in Hank's hands. "I found it on his desk after the funeral. I've been carrying it ever since, hoping somehow I'd find a way to get it to you." Hank's hands shook as he opened the envelope, revealing a single sheet of paper covered with Billy's careful script. "Dear Hank," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then I found you and we've had the chance to talk. I hope we've had time to work through the hurt between us, to remember what we meant to each other as boys." The letter went on to express Billy's love, his forgiveness, his dreams for their renewed relationship. It spoke of grandchildren who needed to know their uncle, of family traditions that should be shared, of the healing that was possible when love was stronger than pride. "I never stopped believing you'd come home," Billy had written. "Family is the most important thing in the world, and you'll always be my family. Whatever happened between us, whatever words we can't take back, you're still my big brother. You're still the man who taught me how to be strong." By the time Hank finished reading, both he and Sarah were crying openly. The letter was Billy's final gift to them both, proof that love could survive decades of separation, that family bonds were stronger than the hurts that tried to break them. "He wanted you to have this too," Sarah said, pulling a small wooden box from the desk drawer. Inside was Billy's wedding ring, the one Hank had seen on his brother's finger in the coffin. "He said if anything happened to him before he found you, I should make sure you got it. He wanted you to know that he kept faith with family, even when family seemed lost." The ring was warm in Hank's palm, engraved with the initials and date that had marked the beginning of Billy's adult life. It represented everything Hank had missed: love, commitment, the kind of future that was built on hope rather than fear. A car door slammed outside, followed by the sound of voices approaching the house. Sarah wiped her eyes and smiled through her tears. "That's Henry and Emma," she said. "They come for Sunday dinner. I think it's time they met their uncle." When the front door opened, Hank found himself face to face with two people who carried Billy's features and Sarah's warmth. Henry had his father's build and serious expression, while Emma possessed the gentle grace that marked both sides of the family. Their initial shock at seeing a stranger in their mother's living room gave way to stunned recognition when Sarah made the introductions. "This is your Uncle Hank," she said simply. "Billy's brother. He's come home." 6 months later, Hank stood in Sarah's backyard watching his great-nephew learn to throw a rope and marveled at how completely his world had changed. 8-year-old Billy Jameson, Henry's boy, named for the grandfather he'd never met, had his father's determination and his great-grandfather's stubborn streak evident in the way he refused to give up despite repeated failures. "Like this, Uncle Hank?" the boy asked, forming another loop with the kind of serious concentration that reminded Hank painfully of Billy at that age. "Better," Hank said, adjusting the child's grip. "Remember what I told you about your wrist? The rope's got to flow natural, like water." Duke lay in the shade nearby, wearing a new collar but still sporting Hank's old dog tags. The German Shepherd had adapted to family life with surprising ease, accepting the chaos of Sunday dinners and birthday parties as if he'd been born to it. Children loved him, and he seemed to understand that his role had expanded from companion to guardian of an entire extended family. The photograph sat on Sarah's mantel now, taken at Easter dinner 2 months ago. It showed 4 generations of Calloways gathered around Sarah's dining room table. Hank at one end, Sarah at the other, with Henry and Emma and their families filling the chairs between. Duke was there too, sitting patiently beside Hank's chair, with the kind of dignity that suggested he understood the importance of the moment. It was the first family photograph that included Hank in 40 years, and looking at it still brought tears to his eyes. Not tears of grief this time, but of gratitude for chances received when he'd thought all chances were gone. "I think that's enough rope work for today," Hank said as young Billy finally managed a decent loop. "Your grandmother's got dinner almost." "Ready." The boy grinned and ran toward the house, rope trailing behind him like a tail. Hank followed more slowly, his arthritis reminding him that 68 was too old for teaching energetic children the finer points of ranching. But Emma said the activity was good for him, that having purpose beyond his own survival was what had been missing from his mountain isolation. She was probably right. Emma had her mother's wisdom and her father's directness, a combination that made her impossible to argue with when she set her mind to something. She'd been the one to suggest he move closer to town, to find a small place where family could visit regularly, without making the long drive to his mountain cabin. He'd resisted, at first, but Duke had settled the matter by clearly preferring the chaos of family life to the quiet of the wilderness. When your dog chose grandchildren over solitude, it was time to reconsider your priorities. The house Sarah had found for him was perfect, small enough for a man who'd grown accustomed to simplicity, but with a yard big enough for Duke and a workshop where he could practice the carpentry skills Billy had tried to teach him as boys. It was 15 minutes from Sarah's place, close enough for regular visits, but far enough to maintain some independence. More importantly, it was 5 minutes from the elementary school where young Billy attended classes, which made after-school visits convenient for everyone involved. "Uncle Hank," Emma's daughter Katie called from the kitchen window. "Grandma Sarah says to ask if you want sweet tea or regular tea with dinner." "Sweet tea," he called back, still amazed at how easily the family had absorbed him into their routines. There had been awkward moments in the beginning, conversations that touched on painful subjects, questions about where he'd been and why he'd stayed away so long. But Billy's children had inherited their father's capacity for forgiveness, and love had proved stronger than decades of absence. The scholarship fund had been Sarah's idea, established in Billy's memory using money from the trust fund that had been waiting for Hank all these years. It helped young people from rural communities attend college, with preference given to those studying education or vocational trades, the kinds of careers Billy had valued and encouraged. Hank served on the selection committee now, meeting quarterly with Sarah and the other board members to review applications and award grants. It was the first real responsibility he'd accepted in 30 years, and he took it seriously. Billy would have wanted to help young people build better futures, and the scholarship fund allowed his generosity to continue long after his death. The land deed to his mountain property had been updated last month, transferring ownership to Henry and Emma with the understanding that it would remain in the family. Hank planned to spend his remaining summers there, teaching the grandchildren about wilderness survival and the value of solitude. But his winters would be spent in town, close to family, available for the daily connections that gave life meaning. Duke bounded into the yard, followed by 3 children who seemed to consider the dog their personal property. The German shepherd tolerated their attention with patient grace, understanding somehow that this chaos was love in action. "Dinner," Sarah called from the back door, and the scattered family began converging on the house with the kind of organized confusion that marked successful families everywhere. Hank took his place at the table, Billy's old chair, which Sarah had quietly designated as his, and looked around at the faces gathered there. Henry, serious and thoughtful like his father, but with a teacher's gift for making complex ideas simple. Emma, graceful and competent, equally comfortable in a hospital emergency room or at a family picnic. Their spouses, good people who'd been welcomed into the family with the same openness that had embraced Hank, and the children, 3 of them now, ranging in age from 6 to 12, each one carrying forward the best qualities of their heritage while adding their own unique personalities to the family mix. "Uncle Hank," young Billy said around a mouthful of Sarah's famous cornbread, "will you tell us another story about Daddy when he was little?" The request had become a regular part of Sunday dinners, and Hank had discovered he had dozens of stories to share. Memories that had been painful in isolation became treasures when shared with family, connecting past and present in ways that honored Billy's memory while building new traditions. "Well," Hank began, settling into the familiar rhythm of storytelling, "did I ever tell you about the time your daddy tried to teach himself to drive the tractor?" The children leaned forward with anticipation, even though they'd heard this story before. Sarah smiled from across the table, her eyes warm with the kind of contentment that came from seeing family heal its own wounds. Outside, the Montana sky stretched toward mountains that had once been Hank's prison but now felt like home. Somewhere in those peaks, Billy's coffin had been moved to a proper grave beside their parents', where Sarah could visit all three of them during her weekly pilgrimages to the cemetery. But Billy's real memorial was here, in this room, in these vases, in the love that had survived 30 years of separation and grown stronger for having been tested. Family, Hank had learned, wasn't about blood alone. It was about choice, about forgiveness, about the daily decision to love people despite their flaws. As the conversation flowed around him and Duke dozed contentedly beside his chair, Hank felt the kind of peace he'd spent 30 years searching for in solitude. It had been there all along, waiting in the connections he'd been too proud to maintain, in the love he'd been too frightened to accept. Billy had known that, had died trying to bring that truth home to his stubborn older brother. In the end, love had proved stronger than pride. Family had proved stronger than fear, and the journey home had been worth every difficult step. The compass sat on Hank's mantle now, pointing not toward magnetic north, but toward the truth that had guided his brother's entire life. Family was the most important thing in the world, and it was never too late to come home.